This is how it happened. This is how the Batman died.
That's it?
So, Demonetize Squad, Demonetize the Justice League recently came out. It's not very good. I know there are some people who are really hoping that Rocksteady could snatch victory from the jaws of defeat, but that really doesn't seem to be the case here. But being totally honest, the writing was on the wall when the first proper gameplay trailer was dropped, and there was an instant visceral dislike for what general audiences saw. It's not a good thing when the first gameplay trailer is received so poorly by audiences that you have to delay your game for an entire year. In fact, it's the exact opposite of good. But while there's a lot that could be said about the reaction to the gameplay of Kill the Justice League, my main interest lies in how the story of the game was received, specifically the titular, well, killing of the Justice League. I guess Rocksteady deserves some credit because you do indeed kill the Justice League. No fake out, no time travel, multiverse bullshit, they're not clones, they're not robots, you very much put bullets in the Justice League members until they die. And audiences, generally speaking, have been less than impressed with the kills shown in this game. And usually, there are some aspiring neurosurgeons who respond to this criticism with the following witty rejoinder. The game is called Kill the Justice League, so of course you killed the Justice League. What else did you expect to happen? Why can't I get this square peg in this round hole? But the people making these responses don't seem to understand that it's not entirely the fact that these characters were killed in the first place that has caused this kind of controversy, it's how they were killed in the story. Which, to be entirely blunt about it, was done in a very lame, shitty way over the course of the entire game. The reaction to the Suicide Squad game has, in turn, opened a lot of old wounds when it comes to other maligned death scenes in video games and pop culture at large, and it led me to wonder, what is the ideal way to kill off a popular, beloved character? Or, to put it in more succinct terms, how do you kill a hero? So, what's the actual issue with the titular killing of the Justice League? Well, let me give you a little bit of a rundown of events that happen in the game. The backstory of the game is that Earth is being invaded by Brainiac. It's always fucking Brainiac in these video games, pick a different bad guy for once. 3 members of the Justice League are now evil, mind-controlled puppets under Brainiac. The Flash is also evil, but not because of mind control, it's just Ezra Miller under the mask.
Claim my 4th Amendment rights to not be unlawful. Hey, you just touched my penis. Please don't do that.
Right off the bat, there's a bit of a problem with the fact that this was the first introduction of several of the Justice League members in the Arkham universe. I don't get to play a video game as Superman, I get to shoot Superman to death. Oh joy, that's so great. It's certainly bad enough that our first introduction to these versions of the Justice League is that we have to murder them, but worse still, Rocksteady had the nerve to base their entire game around this silly concept and couldn't even bother to make the boss fights feel cool or epic. Fighting Superman should feel like fighting a hurricane, like throwing hands against an act of God, a battle you only barely manage to win by the skin of your teeth.
Where did he go? Where did he freaking go?
Orbit. He went into orbit at Mach 7. If you had super hearing, any second you'd hear the pop.
Instead, the 4 incredibly unlikable charisma vacuums of the Suicide Squad just shoot Superman a bunch of times, who flies around like a big bullet sponge idiot, and then he just falls over and dies without much ceremony. Why was this the basis for your entire game if you weren't even gonna make it interesting? I'm just so very confused by all of this. But, for as bad as the various members of the Justice League were handled in the story of this game, the real reason people are so mad was specifically how Batman was handled. You see, this isn't just some random incarnation of the character like it is with the Justice League members. For some baffling reason, this game is meant to be a sequel to the Arkhamverse. This is a specific version of Batman that audiences have grown attached to over 4 entire games, and now if you were to ever replay one of the Arkham games, all you'll be thinking of is Batman is going to die sitting on a park bench getting domed by Harley Quinn. The same Harley Quinn who, in all the previous Arkham games, was a joke character that Batman was able to beat with ease. The same Harley Quinn who, in this game, has the absolute audacity to try and lecture Batman on morality.
You had a good run, Brucey. Flying around Gotham, punching bad guys, cleaning up the streets, causing long-term mental and emotional damage to everyone you knew.
You're an active participant in several cases of mass murder and terrorism, please shut the fuck up. It's all too likely that people would have been unhappy with this version of Batman being killed off no matter what, but what really got people so absolutely incensed was that his death was so lame and that they took the moment to humiliate and denigrate him for some bewildering reason. This isn't presented as a joke or anything, it's presented like Harley has a legitimate point to anything she's saying. Rocksteady, unironically, are you stupid?
Bitch, I might be.
This whole sequence would have been terrible in just about any Batman story, but the issues are compounded because this specifically is a version of Batman that audiences are familiar with and are attached to. It doesn't really take too much for audiences to get attached to a main character. Prototype was a 2008 open-world superhero game where you play as Alex Mercer, an angry, grumbly man with slick drip and even slicker superpowers. The game, naturally, has a plot. I don't remember it all that well, it wasn't really all that deep or long, I was more interested in elbow-dropping tanks from the top of skyscrapers than playing the story. But there was enough to the plot that a decent section of the fandom grew attached to Alex Mercer as a character. So much so that when the sequel came out and Alex Mercer was the villain who you kill at the end of the game, those same people were genuinely pretty pissed off. Really, anytime you see any discussion about Prototype 2, there will all too likely be people commenting about Alex Mercer's character assassination and how much they hate James Heller, the protagonist that came after. And if players get that attached to Alex Mercer, the main character in a game where the gameplay massively outweighs the narrative in importance, what level of attachment do you think players will have towards the main character in a game where the narrative has much more importance than the gameplay? The Last of Us is undeniably one of the most popular games that Sony has ever put out, so much so that it's been re-released almost as much as Skyrim has, and Joel, the main protagonist of the first game, is already one of the most iconic main characters in gaming. A character can get pretty far when they have a tragic backstory, a great dynamic with the secondary protagonist, and an amazing performance both in a video game and in live action. And so players, understandably I would say, were fairly upset when 5 minutes into The Last of Us Part 2, Joel got his head stoved in by a golf club. There's a lot to be said about the story for The Last of Us Part 2 and hours of video content debating and discussing it, so I'll try and boil down my perspective as concisely as I can. I think it was a pretty bad call to make Joel an idiot just to facilitate the plot, and I think it's equally bad that they decided to devote a lot of the playtime after his death to playing as his killer. No amount of scenes in the world would magically make audiences warm up to Abby, no matter how many wholesome heckin' puppers she's shown playing with. And a lot of the audience, similarly, would never change their stance about how they felt about the first game's ending. Naughty Dog can try all they want to say that the cure definitely would have worked, no matter how nonsensical that sounds, but a lot of people are convinced that Joel did the right thing. Over the course of the first game, they had grown really attached to him as a character, so naturally they were pretty cheesed off that he was killed in a really underwhelming way. You were then forced to play as his killer, and the narrative tried very hard to demonize him at every turn. It seems to me that the Kill the Justice League writers were drawing more than a few notes from The Last of Us Part 2, sacrificing popular characters on the dreaded altar of subverted expectations. These types of kills are very reliant on shock value to surprise the audience, but the thing about a shock is, it doesn't last. Usually, once the shock of a scene like this is played out, the audience is given time to digest what they've just been through, and ultimately they'll find scenes like this don't hold up much under scrutiny. It's pretty easy for me to imagine the writers for stories like this going, aha, you went into this plot expecting to see cool adventures with this character you like, well, now instead of that, they're dead. Fuck you. Bet you didn't expect that to happen. And they're right, I didn't expect that to happen. I expected a story that wasn't totally dog shit. I am passionately, deathly curious to know exactly what's going to happen with season 2 of the TV show. It'll only be the second time HBO has had Pedro Pascal's skull caved in by a giant monster. The deaths of characters like Luke Skywalker, Joel, or Arkham Batman are the kind of storytelling beats that live in infamy. People are going to be talking about these things for years to come, and not in a good way. You took the faith and trust of your audience and then absolutely shattered it for the sake of a cheap shock. And it probably goes without saying that it's fairly difficult to restore that kind of trust. But having bitched about how not to kill a character for so long, let's actually discuss some good examples of heroic characters being killed off. Red Dead Redemption 1 and 2 are two games that really don't need any sort of introduction, and the protagonists of both games, John Marston and Arthur Morgan, are similarly beloved by gamers everywhere. Similar to Joel, players ended up getting fairly attached to these two characters over the course of both games' very lengthy storylines, and though they both died at the end of their own adventures, those deaths, for as tragic as they are, never really got any major backlash from players. Of course, it does help that both of their deaths are foreshadowed well in advance. Dutch all but says to John that the government are gonna come for him next.
When I'm gone, they'll just find another monster. They have to. Because they have to justify their wages.
Plus, well, did you honestly think that Rockstar were gonna end a game with John Marston whiling away the days with ranch work?
What the fuck?
And Arthur's tuberculosis diagnosis means that he's a dead man walking by the halfway point in the story, so audiences were able to brace for the inevitable subconsciously or otherwise. It isn't particularly difficult to draw some parallels between Arthur's death and Joel's death, both men being beaten to a bloody pulp by a villain, but the main difference between the two is, for one thing, Arthur didn't need to be written like an idiot to artificially push him into that position. And for another thing, Arthur went down swinging. He fought tooth and nail to last as long as he could just to give John a few extra precious seconds to get away. There's, well, a little bit of dignity to it. It's not like somebody blew John Marston's brains out with a single bullet and then tried to piss on his corpse. To use an example that more closely ties into discussions around the Suicide Squad, let's take a brief look at Gotham Knights. You know, that's probably the first time someone has said, let's take a look at Gotham Knights since that game came out. The whole premise of Gotham Knights is that Batman is dead at the very start of the story, and so his menagerie of sidekicks have to pick up the slack and become Gotham City's new protectors. In fact, the game actually opens with Batman biting the dust. So how does he die in this continuity? Oh, just, you know, a duel to the death with Ra's al Ghul, one of his most dangerous enemies. An entire choreographed fight scene where Batman is both smart and competent, but going against an opponent that is equally smart and competent, as opposed to being defeated by 4 idiots in adamantium plot armor solely because the script says so. Now, make no mistake, this doesn't mean that Gotham Knights is suddenly a misunderstood masterpiece or even a particularly good game in any capacity, but it is pretty funny that the game everyone wrote off as the B-team effort has managed to totally destroy Rocksteady in the plot department. It should probably go without saying that you absolutely can have your hero die in a somewhat underwhelming manner, or even a downright tragic one. It does not need to be a binary between nothing bad ever happens to these characters and these stupid loser idiots get horribly murdered and then pissed on. Avdol, one of the main heroes in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 3, has a very sudden and somewhat anticlimactic death, and yet it's not really the kind of thing that makes you think, wow, that was bullshit. Sure, his death is at least partially reliant on shock value for the sake of raising the stakes, but nothing about it makes you think it goes against the context of what's established in the series. Everything about it is logical. And more importantly, the guy who kills him doesn't get away with it, and Avdol died trying to save his 2 friends from danger. It's a sudden and very harsh moment, and you get the distinct impression that Avdol definitely did not deserve what happened to him, and yet the moment still doesn't end up feeling like bullshit like some of the other deaths I mentioned previously. If I were to try and boil down the mechanics of a good hero death into a few core components, this is what I would go with. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, their death needs to feel logical. If you're artificially pushing a character into a situation they wouldn't normally end up in, or you're writing them out of character in order to get a certain result from them, then fans of said character are going to be able to smell your bullshit from a mile away. Secondly, their death needs to feel at least a little bit respectful towards the character. If you happen to be writing their death from an absolutely spiteful point of view, then people are going to be able to see that well in advance.
Are we done with your bad stand-up routine?
Almost. But you always gotta end on your best joke.
The sheer contempt that the writers for Kill the Justice League had toward the various Justice League members is rendered all the more apparent by the reverence they obviously had towards Wonder Woman. The absolute lack of respect is therefore broadcast to the audience in giant, pulsating neon letters. Lastly, I would say for a good hero death, you need to provide a sense of closure on their adventures that doesn't end up souring their previous adventures in the process. I don't know about the rest of you, but I personally can't really enjoy any adventures involving Luke Skywalker because whenever I see Luke Skywalker, I'm thinking in the back of my mind, oh, he's going to be a sad loser on an island in a few years' time. And if you follow those 3 rules with any degree of focus, it really shouldn't be all that hard to kill off a popular character without incurring much of a backlash in the process. If a character is beloved and popular around the world, you really don't have a right to complain if people are upset to see them being treated like shit. I genuinely don't know what Rocksteady were thinking with any part of this game or how they think it would have gone over well with general audiences, but oh well. I won't cry for you, Rocksteady. You're already dead.